this, and it will then be sent out to all participants later on, probably tomorrow morning or so. So we will get underway. So as an introduction, so I'm Martin Simon. I'm one of the Microsoft commercial execs and licensing specialists here at Bytes. And today, or in this session, we're going to go through kind of a hybrid infrastructure and licensing in public clouds and the rules around that. And we will obviously answer any questions if you have any as we go as well. There is also a Q&A at the end, so if you want to wait, that's up to you. If you don't, just obviously please just raise your hand and we'll get it answered if we can. So on the agenda today, the first thing we're going to look at is kind of the basics of Windows Server licensing and the rules around that and the additions. We'll then look at System Center licensing, again, rules around that and the client management cows that are required within that. We'll briefly look at core infrastructure, which obviously is both System Center and Windows, but we'll get to it. The basics in regards to SQL Server, and then some software assurance benefits that will be kind of relevant to both SQL Server, Windows going forward, and especially with the Outsourcer Rules that changed in October 2019. But again, we will get into that a bit further down the line. So the first thing we're going to look at is Windows Server licensing and licensing both standard and data center. So with Windows Server, and the newest edition is 2022, any user or device internally within a business requires a client access license that accesses a Windows Server OS within the environment. If you do have external users, and again, we'll have some scenarios in regards to this a little later on as well, there is other licensing that we need to look at to cover those users from a client access perspective. So the real basics of Windows Server licensing is it is licensed per core, and those per core licenses are on the physical server, so not the virtual server or any VM that's sat on it. It's always the physical server and doesn't include hyperthreading as well. So the actual number of physical servers that are purchased with that box. We always need to license all physical cores, and there are minimums to that. So for 8 cores per processor or a 16 core per physical server. And again, we've got some scenarios that we'll show you as we go through as well. So as a scenario, so if we have obviously servers in the center, again, it's core based. So we're looking at this one individual server itself. And this server has 8 cores and 1 processor. So to license this physical box, we need to give it at least 16 cores because that is the minimum, and that will cover that physical box. We will go into data center and standard in a second, but the real kind of basics of it is that's how it sits. So if we look at a second scenario within that as well. So we have 2 processors, and each processor has 12 cores, obviously more than the minimum, so a total of 24 cores. We need to cover that physical host with a minimum of 24 core licenses. Core license packs come in either 2 packs or 16 packs. So in these scenarios, they are all 2 core packs, really just for ease of maths, I guess, just dividing by 2. And then if we look at a third scenario, again, so probably a bigger processor box, we have 4 processors, 4 cores. As the minimum is 8 cores per processor, we need to license each of those processors with a minimum of 4 cores. So when we look at that, we actually had to look at a 32 cores in total to cover that physical host. When it comes to the client access licenses, you'll see on the left-hand side all the user cows. So these are users with multiple devices. It is more cost effective to cover that specific user for a user cow to allow access to a Windows server on each of their devices, so their corporate devices. Obviously, there are scenarios where device space is more cost effective. So when you have shared devices within a business, and those users obviously do not have a CAL, we would look at licensing each of those with a client, each device with a client access license. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to then, we mentioned about external users. So if we look into external users, so the graphic in the top middle, this is an external user, so not a user within the organization, and you have an external facing virtual machine or web backend, or web front end, sorry, with backends. What you need to do is license either the physical host with an external connector license, so Windows Server external connector license. That allows any external user to access that physical host that is hosting those virtual machines, for example, for externally facing users. Another way to look at it is to actually cover a specific virtual machine. So how we can do that is, you'll see from the graphic that external connector is a virtual machine and it is moving from host to host, so it can follow that virtual machine can move from host to host within the cluster, allowing external users to use it. If you are doing that, you need to have software assurance because that virtual machine has the ability to move from host to host. So that has to have software assurance to do that. So if you were looking in this scenario, again, you only had 3 physical boxes. It could be more cost effective to cover all physical boxes. That wouldn't require software assurance to do that. If you had multiple virtual machines, or less than 3 virtual machines, for example, it would be more cost effective to cover the virtual machine with software assurance to allow these moving from back and forth within the cluster. So when we are looking at cluster licensing, if we have a physical box and we have multiple virtual machines, we would cover that with data center. So the ratio, and we'll go into a small ratio a little bit later as well, the ratio of standard stacking to data center is normally around 10, 11 virtual machines. So if you do have more than that on a physical host, data center is the most cost-effective way of covering that virtual machine. If we have 2 boxes and those virtual machines can move from host to host, we need to cover both of those physical boxes to allow for all of those virtual machines to sit on them. So we would cover both of those with a data center license, obviously covering all physical cores with a minimum of 16. If we then had a 3rd host within the cluster, and again, those VMs can move from host to host for kind of high availability, whenever they want to turn one off and they will move. Again, we need to cover it for data center licensing because it could host all of those virtual machines on there. So within a highly virtualized environment, it is always, or pretty much always, more cost effective to cover those physical hosts with data center licenses. It allows you to install as many as you require. For standard licensing, so again, we've spoken about data center, so allows for unlimited virtualization on a physical box. When you cover a physical box with standard licensing, it will allow you to install 2 virtual machines. If you require more than 2 virtual machines, there is a kind of a wording called stacking. So if you have, and again from the graphic, if you have 4 virtual machines, we can double the licensing, which allows for double the amount of virtual machines within that environment. And again, if we add another 2, so we get to 6 virtual machines, we add another 16 cores, or the total physical cores to be able to allow for 6 virtual machines. Bear in mind that if you have 2 physical boxes and 4 virtual machines, we need to cover both of those physical boxes to allow for the maximum number of 4 virtual machines that you have covered. So always something worth thinking about when doing it. So now on to System Center licensing. So with System Center licensing, there again, it's very similar to core and cal model. Bear in mind, the management server install itself is a free of charge install if you are managing endpoints or servers and virtual machines. So when we are looking at the endpoints, we need to cover each of those endpoints with a client management license. So some of these will, a lot of these client management licenses and Windows Server CALs come in certain suites as well, which again, we'll go into a little bit further on. But each of those devices being managed require a client management license. If we are looking at the actual managed servers, we need to cover them the exact same way as we cover Windows Server licensing itself. So, for example, again, we have 2 processors with 12 cores each. This managed server, or to manage all of the virtual machines on that host, we require 24 cores of System Center server licensing. And again, so on for the other items and other hosts that you may have. Again, System Center comes in standard and data center. So the majority of the time it would match what you have from a Windows Server point of view, especially if you were managing all of those virtual machines on that physical host. As mentioned, obviously it still comes with the same 2 virtual machines for standard and unlimited for data center. So normally again we would match them up. But everything on the left-hand side, from configuration manager, ops manager, DPM, etc., all of these components, when it comes to System Center server, cannot be procured individually. We need to license it with System Center server license itself, even if you were just utilizing one of those services within that license. When it comes to client access licenses for each of those individual items, they can be procured individually. So if you wanted to use Service Manager, for example, you could procure a Service Manager client access or client management license as an addition to any kind of package you already have. We have added the table in here again just to show what System Center products or services come with different plans you may have already. I would say a lot of users or a lot of customers now have Microsoft 365 plans or Office 365 plans. So anyone with an M365 or a Microsoft 365 does have some of those components already within their use right. So the ability to have all those online services plus the client access and management access licenses moving forward. So I'm going to briefly talk about Core Infrastructure Server Suite. So this is, Microsoft brought this out, which in short, it's Windows Server and System Center bundled as one product, but you have the ability to install obviously both. And doing so, you have a reduced cost in doing it. So again, the newest version is 2022, always matches up with System Center and Windows Server, and available on most programs today. There is additional discounts if you have 400 cores or more, and it covers the total amount of your estate. And in which case you can look at what is called a server cloud enrollment. So a separate contract, a separate enterprise contract to cover all of your Windows estate with Core Infrastructure Server Suite with a minimum of 400 cores. And there is an additional discount on top of that as well. So something worth looking at, especially if you're covering everything within your estate already. So Sql licensing, and we're going to go briefly into the additions, and then we're going to go briefly into the license rules around it. Where a lot of the rules come in is when it comes to software assurance, which we're going to do a little bit later on as well. So additions that are available today. So the majority of enterprise and standard, which can be procured on volume licensing. And then you have Express, which is a free download from Microsoft themselves. And you also have SQL Developer. So if you have a Visual Studio's community subscription, you are able to go in and download SQL Developer for the purpose of test and development within your environment. That is a free install to do. It gives you all the features of SQL Server Standard and Enterprise, but it is only for the use of test and development and some UAT as well. So bear that in mind if you are looking at some testing. So when we look at the basics, there are two models with SQL. So one is the server cal licensing. So this is currently only available in standard. It used to be available in standard and enterprise, but they dropped it for enterprise many years ago. This is where you license the either physical box, if it's not virtualized, or a virtual machine of SQL. And then you license every user or device that has access to that SQL server, whether that is direct or indirect as well. So if we have a user today and they access an application that's sat on one of your virtual machines, and the back end of that is a SQL server covered with server cal model, this user requires a server cal to have access to that SQL instance. So they are indirectly accessing that SQL server. Something, again, always to take note, because people aren't directly accessing it, they will always believe that they do not need or may not need a cal within that. So if we're looking for a virtual machine with server cal, again, we just license that virtual machine for SQL Server Standard. And again, every user or device that's accessing directly or indirectly, again, to that virtual machine. If that virtual machine is in a highly virtualized state or a highly virtualized cluster, we need to make sure that it does have software assurance for license mobility, for the ability of that virtual machine to move from host to host within that cluster. And again, we're going to go into license mobility a little later on. We'll go a bit deeper into that. So the other way of licensing SQL is per core. So this is available with both standard and enterprise today, and you must license a minimum of 4 cores, both on a physical processor or any virtual machine that has V cores assigned to it. So we need to make sure there is always 8. So you can see from the graphic below, obviously if you have 6, we need to cover 6. If it has less than 6 or less than 4, we still need to cover it with 4 core licenses for it to be compliant. Again, with a virtual machine, we need to make sure that we are covering that 4 core minimum. And with software assurance, it will allow that virtual machine to move from host to host within the cluster you may have. Also with software assurance, again for server cal and per core, you do have the ability to move to a third-party cloud or use Microsoft's Azure Hybrid Benefit as well with software assurance. And again, we'll go a little bit deeper into that a little later on. So with software assurance has to be procured at time of the license being procured at the same time. So we can't add software assurance later on to get the rights that we require. We have to procure license and software assurance at the same time, and that goes for all software assurance. So that's a very high level of software assurance for every product gives new version rights. For most products, it will give step-up rights. So for example, if you have SQL Standard today and you wanted to step up to Enterprise, if you have software assurance, you have the right to do that, and you pay the difference between Standard and Enterprise. So always worth kind of looking at that, especially if it's something you may want to do in the future. So it also brings license mobility. I've briefly spoken about it, and we'll go into a bit more detail on that because there are two types of license mobility. It also gives hybrid use benefit, so the ability to utilize the licenses you procured on premise and take them to Microsoft Azure and reduce the cost of that virtual machine or that SQL database and only pay for the compute of that. Again, going into hybrid benefit, there is a session a little later on cost optimization, which they will go a lot deeper into hybrid benefit and examples of it, and where that can be consumed and kind of the percentage discounts that are available when using it in that regard. And there are also, for some items, there are failover rules. So things like SQL, BizTalk, there are failover rules. And again, we're going to go through failover rules moving forward as well. So license mobility. So license mobility comes in two aspects. There is license mobility within server farms. So within a cluster, gives you the ability to have a virtual machine move from host to host within a cluster and no extra cost. Again, I've got an example of this a little later. There is also something called license mobility for software assurance, which is the ability to take that virtual machine into a third-party cloud or a third-party data center or hosted provider. So when we look at license mobility, it's frozen. Bear with me. Apologies. Let's skip through. Apologies, bear with me a second. Okay, so if we have 3 hosts and we cover those SQL virtual machines, the 2 SQL virtual machines we can see on the screen, if we cover those with software assurance, that allows those virtual machines, or let's say, for example, one of them, to move from host to host within the on-premise or dedicated host to yourself clusters. It also gives you the ability to move one of them to potentially a cloud environment, whether that be Azure or a third party that you have. Software assurance with SQL is pretty much always a benefit to the business, and especially from a compliance point of view. So always worth looking at. So again, as I mentioned, we can move to a service provider's data center. We can move to Microsoft Azure with software assurance. We can move to listed providers. I'll go a little bit more into that shortly. But they must have software assurance to do that. And I'll go through the previous rules just to make sure that you're fully aware of that as well. So when we look at license mobility across server farms, there is, again, I'm not going to go through the whole point of the whole depth for you, but when we look at the different license models that we have, so when we're looking at things like per core today, which we've just spoken about with SQL, when we're looking at server cow, which again is SQL, per core could be things like BizTalk as well, and things like management servers. So any of these management servers would be the system center piece. What that allows you to do is have a ratio. It allows you to have a ratio of what you have on premise to manage a number of management servers in a third party. So for example, if we look at the bottom line, we have a management server, we have 16 cores of System Center with active software assurance. That allows you to go and manage 10 OSEs in a third party or a public cloud. So bear that in mind if you are moving to a cloud kind of hybrid estate, you are entitled to take those licenses if they have software assurance and reduce the cost of your cloud environment moving forward. With any license mobility, there is a document that needs to be filled in to show that you have brought your own license to that environment. So this is from a compliance point of view. So in the event of an audit, Microsoft may ask you to see where you have moved that license to and how you have the license to do it. So those documents will need to be done if you are moving it to a third party or a Microsoft estate. So keep that in mind. When we look at failover for SQL, so SQL has additional rights when it comes to software assurance. So if we are looking at kind of server 1 here, this is the active virtual machine, for example, and it has 12 cores assigned to it. You are also entitled at no extra cost, apart from the software assurance cost, to have a secondary passive instance of that server environment. So a passive instance is something that doesn't give client data until the need it moves away from active to passive. Microsoft also brought out recently the ability to have a third DR, so a third passive instance in a DR state, also for that software assurance cost. So keep that in mind. It's not just active passive now. You can have active passive DR. So keep that in mind. If you, again, you may already have active passive, you now have DR as well if you still have software assurance. They also changed the ruling that there is actually no cost to have your passive instance in Microsoft Azure as well. So you could have your active on-premise, as the diagram explains, and an Azure virtual machine with SQL on, where you can click the button for I have a license of hybrid benefit. As long as it is in a passive state, you are able to install it in Azure and just pay for the compute of that VM. Another specific use for SQL, and this only comes with SQL Enterprise per core. With software assurance, it allows you to run a Power BI report server on-premise on dedicated tin to yourself, or in Microsoft Azure, again dedicated to you as a business, so that you can run report server and create any kind of Power BI that you want to from them. Bear in mind that if you are sharing those dashboards, the person who is sharing does require, so the person creating and sharing does require a Power BI Pro per user subscription. So no access, no extra additional cost to view those dashboards, but the creator and the publisher of those dashboards does require an additional Power BI Pro subscription to do so. Again, something worth looking at if you need some analytics or want some kind of pretty graphs from Power BI and you have SQL Enterprise with software assurance, it may be worth having a look at that and seeing what you could do moving forward. So, Outsourcer Rules. So Microsoft prior to October 2019 changed the rules around the use of licenses in a listed provider's estate. So Microsoft software purchased without software assurance was able to be installed previously prior to October 2019 on dedicated tin in a listed provider's estate. again, listed provider is seen in AWS, so Google, Microsoft, Alibaba, as explained there. They changed that term, and if you do have licenses or want to have licenses in those listed provider estates, it must be on dedicated tin, but it now must have software assurance. Even though that tin is dedicated to you, it has to have software assurance to move it to a listed provider. Any software deployed prior to October 2019 that didn't have software assurance, you can stay as is, but can't upgrade it to any addition that was after October 2019. So if you are looking to upgrade anything that you may have in these listed provider data centers, you will need to look at the addition and when that addition was brought out by Microsoft. If it was after 2019, you now must add software assurance or rebuy licensed software assurance to use in those listed provider data centers. Other items, so that goes with Windows Server licensing and server application licensing. So bear in mind that Windows Server doesn't have license mobility. So Windows Server cannot move over to a listed provider data center. Only external connectors can, and things like CALs and RDS CALs, etc. Things like SQL, BizTalk, Project, SharePoint, they have to have software assurance to move to those listed provider data centers on dedicated tin from now on. Other items of note that came out of that as well. Anyone with Microsoft Apps for Enterprise cannot install on a listed provider estate. So if you have Office 365 E3 or above, or Microsoft 365 E3, and you have Microsoft Apps for Enterprise, it cannot be installed on a listed providers, even if it's a dedicated tin. It can only be installed locally on a network server to you internally. It can be done on Microsoft Azure or with a what they call a qualified multi-tenant hosted partner, so a QMTH. There is a list of those, and again, that list is, we'll share it with this deck as well. There is only a certain amount of providers that are able to host Microsoft Apps for Enterprise for those users. Bear that in mind. Another item worth of note, again, from the product terms and from these changes with those listed providers. If you have Windows 10 per user, it can be installed only on locally in Azure or on a qualified multi-tenant hosted partner also. You can't use that for a listed provider environment. If you do have a listed provider, again, and the example below, such as AWS, you can use VDA per user. So if you have Microsoft 365 today, which includes Windows 10/11, you would need to add on a VDA E3 subscription as a minimum per user to utilize or access a Windows 10 or 11 machine in a listed provider's data center, such as AWS. And that is it from me. Does anyone have any questions? Maybe not as exciting as Power Platforms.
Sorry, I've got a question.
Go ahead.
With regards to the VDA that you were just talking about,
yes.
Are you saying that you'd need an additional VDA license if you were going into AWS?
Correct.
So Azure would be covered by your existing M365, but if you're moving away into AWS or another third-party cloud, then you would need a VDA license as well.
Correct, yeah, and to that as well, there is a VDA add-on to M365.
Yeah.
So it isn't the full cost, but there is still an additional cost to use in a listed provider's data center. So yes, only VDA per user allows it.
Right. Okay. You haven't covered off RDS, have you?
I haven't, no.
So, and probably this isn't not the right time or place, but if you're using, would you use RDS to connect to VDA as a broker?
So you could do. It would depend on the solution that you have within that that virtual desktop environment. So RDS is not always required for VDI environments, but if you are going through an RDS GUI, then it would be required. And my understanding is it does have license mobility rights. Therefore, you would have to have software assurance if a user was accessing a VDI through RDS into a listed provider.
Excellent. Okay.
So RDS would require an SA for that. It actually does always require, if you even if you had a Windows Server VDI session in Azure, you require RDS SA as well as in that. So yeah, even more so in a listed provider.
Thank you.
No problem. Anyone else? Like I said, not always the most enthralling licensing, but someone's kind of got to do it, I guess. There is a poll, so Catherine has put a poll out. If you could fill in that, and if you had a couple of minutes, that would be great. If there is any further questions that you want to actually speak to specifically on maybe your environment, or you have some queries with potentially not having software assurance, and you obviously don't want to bring it up within here, please get hold of your account manager at Bytes, or even speak to tell me more at bytes.co.uk. So if you don't have an account manager, email that. If you do email your account manager, we can jump on, they can get myself or the rest of the team to jump on a call with you to go through your specific requirement within your environment, because we know everyone is different. So if that's it, I'm going to say thank you very much. There are more sessions later, so enjoy your lunch, and there is a modern workplace one at 1 o'clock. So hopefully we'll see the majority of you there. Take care.